Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the, September Equipped Live. My name's Jackie. I'll be walking us through this program. We did get a significant number of questions added, so I think that the questions that we have, I think will take us through quite a few Equipped Lives, which is my favorite way is to have people submit questions. It's either that or I just get to grill Greg with my own questions, and I don't think that's anyone's favorite. So we're going to go ahead and work our way through this list of questions, but you are still able to submit questions at any time, and we'll just add them to the list, and those can be sent to me. So, Greg, welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
So we're just going to go ahead and get started. The first couple of questions actually were submitted by, Phil Zaborni, but on half of the Air Park Industrial team. So I think they submitted them together. But the first question is, how does sustainability factor into the IFMC future growth strategy?
Sustainability. I'm assuming that means environmental sustainability, and that's part of what the United Nations came up with as what are called ESG standards, so environmental social governance. And so that's an attempt to sustain the world. And of course, other governments are participating voluntarily with that, but there's a lot of momentum there with those standards. That's a big topic that could take the whole session here. I guess what I'm going to try to do is refrain from commenting on the politics or even on the technical feasibility, and just focus on the impact that I perceive that to have on the future growth of the IFMC. And like any other big initiatives like that, there are lots of pros and lots of cons. I think for the IFMC, it's a net positive. If I look at what are the positives for the IFMC, I think the positives are that any big initiative like this, and I mean, this is huge, causes change, which causes new problems that our customers need to solve. And that's what we're always looking for, our customers with problems and with money. And the reason I think that's good for the IFMC is that this type of initiative takes innovation. That means that there's experimentation going on, which means that now you're building first of a kind machinery, first of a kind equipment, one of a kind, small batch, and over time it works its way toward flow manufacturing, which is really something we typically don't get involved with other than making capital equipment for the flow manufacturing. So my guess is this thing's going to play out over the next couple decades and be very positive for the IFMC. What are the negatives? These are standards by the United Nations that now tend to turn into regulation by federal governments, state governments, local governments. Regulation is like friction in the free market system, and it's typically not our friend. And so that is going to be a negative. We'll have to deal with it. But I think, again, there's a net positive. If we look at an example of how I see this playing out and being beneficial, we can really look at what's happening, and I'd be surprised if most people aren't already aware of all the activity around solar and wind power and electric vehicles. And that's all part of that environmental sustainability. If we go back to the early 1900s and we look at the transition from horses and carriages to horseless carriages, there certainly are a lot of differences, but there are a lot of similarities as well to the transition now from internal combustion engines to electric vehicles. And so if you look at it from a energy perspective or from a system perspective, when we had the horses and carriages, you were converting hay and grain into energy that the horses used to pull the carriages to carry people and things. Once we had the horseless carriage, now we were converting petroleum through internal combustion engines into energy that drove the vehicles that carried the people and the things. With the latest transition, now we're converting wind and solar into energy that drives electric motors that drive the vehicles that move the people and the things. So that's just the impact on the vehicles. But if we look at now, when we had horseless carriages, now we needed gas stations, we needed roads, we needed a whole host of things that were big, expensive projects that needed to be done, needed lots of capital equipment. Today, it's very similar. We need batteries, we need the electrical grid. The interesting thing here is that if you look at internal combustion engines and the vehicles that use those, there's quite an investment up front for that vehicle, but there's also a pretty substantial cost to operate that vehicle over its lifetime. With electric vehicles, there's a much heavier upfront cost to manufacture the vehicle, and then a lesser cost to operate it. But that upfront cost starts with the need for all sorts of unique materials. And so, again, one of the more common ones that people talk about is lithium. And right now, there isn't enough lithium in the world that's readily available to achieve all of the goals of ESG. And there's even less cobalt, which is what's necessary to activate the lithium so that it can get enough energy density for a vehicle. All those problems need to be worked out, but now you need to mine the materials, usually tons and tons of material, to get a little bit of metal to make your electric motor or your battery or whatever. And all of that means added mining equipment, added manufacturing equipment just to harvest those metals so that you can build cars and the infrastructure. And so I think this is potentially very, very positive for us. And as far as the strategy, I think what the strategy that we need to implement at the IFMC is simply keep identifying customers with problems and with money, and keep doing what we've been doing, which is adapting to the needs that our customers have.
So if we were to put on a continuum manufacturing, all types of manufacturing of the biggest negative impact on the environment and to the least negative impact on the environment, I would think, and correct me if I'm wrong, that the IFMC would be at the least impact end of that spectrum, correct?
I think so. Yeah, the really big impact is in the mining of the materials, and we tend to be on the light manufacturing end, which of course most folks on the call have been in the plants, have seen that. I mean, it's a pretty nice environment. Certainly it's not like going into a 5-star hotel, but it's pretty clean.
Yeah, I've always wanted to stay overnight on the floor of one of the shops. So I would say that the IFMC's contribution to sustainability is not necessarily looking at what we're doing to have an impact on the environment, but really how we're helping our customers have less of an impact on the environment through purchasing equipment from us to do what they do better and more efficiently. Could that be accurate?
I think so. And I'm trying to stay away from the politics of this and
Right.
the technical feasibility, but it does raise some interesting questions because, like with the mining of cobalt, if you really understand how that's harvested and how that's mined, that is really, really ugly. And
Yes.
so it does raise the question of, if we really wanted to live up to those United Nations standards or those ESG standards, would we decide to not buy from the companies that are providing the cobalt? Right now, nobody seems to be too worried about that. And my position on that really is that I let the local and the state, I let the government tell us what are the regulations, and we'll operate within the regulations. But there are varying opinions on how socially appropriate some of that stuff is.
Yeah, it's hard not to go down that path, but we'll move on to question 2. Also from the Air Park Industrial Team. Are there any specific threats from competitors or market entrants that you watch for or that you are consistently watching?
There really aren't any specific threats from competitors, but don't mistake. I mean, there always are threats, and that's partly the beauty of the free market, is that many companies are trying to innovate, trying to come up with better ways to do the things that we're doing. And so that is out there. We need to pay attention, but there's lots of them. And there's no one specific threat from a competitor that I typically pay attention to. As far as defending the IFMC from those threats, I think diversification, which we are pretty diversified in a lot of markets with a lot of different customers, a lot of different products. Agility and speed are really the best defense against those kind of threats. And I think the best defense is just a good offense. And human beings tend to have a natural bias toward playing defense. So I tend not to pay attention to the threats quite as much because I'm counting on other people alerting me to that. But I really focus on offense because that isn't as normal. And that's what gets the orders in the door and keeps things working.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to go ahead and ask a third question. It's probably going to take us over our time, but if we didn't go over our time, it wouldn't be Equipped Live, right? So next question, also from Air Park Industrial Team. How do you or the IFMC mitigate the risk related to economic downturns and geopolitical issues?
Primarily just by staying alert to world events and really differentiating between the long-term trends and the short-term problems, issues, whatever you want to call it. And so the analogy that I like is differentiating between the tide versus the waves on the top of the water. And you need to pay attention to both. But the question really was economic downturns, geopolitical issues, those tend to be longer term. And so we need to pay attention to the tide. I think the conversation we've just been having about the ESG standards and the transition to electrification is one of those long-term trends that certainly will be impacting things. I tend to pay attention to demographics of the different countries, and try to anticipate. And again, this is long-term stuff, but what countries are rising, what countries are maybe failing, and just be aware of how it's working. And matter of fact, that topic came up in a sales conversation that I had just a couple hours ago of what's happening in Europe versus what's happening in the US and how should we position ourselves. So that's really how I try to mitigate that. As far as playing offense, again, it gets back to agility, speed, solve problems, and focus on early stage, first of a kind, one of a kind, small batch. That's the strategy.
And just a quick follow-up to that. You're not alone doing this. Do you have a specific team of people? Do you just rely on those who report directly to you? I guess how do you make sure that you're continually paying attention to these and having conversations about it?
Yeah, good question. At the IFMC level, I tend to pay attention to those big long-term trends. My sense is that the folks at the BGM level are focusing on their markets and focusing a little bit more tightly, and probably are tired of me talking about the big trends. But I think so. They're looking at it through a little bit different focus on their lens, so to speak. But I mean, you can't be successful with the products over a long term if you're not paying attention to that.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, this does bring us to the end of our time. We have, like I said, a whole list of questions, more on risk, some on Greg personally. What does he do about certain things? What are favorites of his, historical things? Oh, just a whole slew of topics that people ask questions about. And I'm pretty excited to ask these questions in the next several Equipped Lives. We did have a couple of technology glitches throughout this, so I do apologize. I think it was still decently okay to follow along with, and I'll try to edit those out when we do get that posted on the YouTube channel. Our next Equip Live is scheduled for October 21st. An email will go out about that, so you can pay attention to your email or block that off if you'd like to already. That all being said, Greg, any final comments?
Well, excuse me, to build a little bit on the focus on the risks and maybe the problems, I like a quote by Steve Maraboli where he says, "Success is not the absence of problems, it's the ability to deal with them." And so that kind of gets right back to my one of my favorite topics of competency.
So success is not the absence of problems, it's the ability to deal with them. Is that correct?
Correct.
All right, there was a little glitch in there, so I wanted to make sure we got that out in one full sentence. I really like that. So excellent. All right, well, we will conclude this and we'll get that email out to everybody. Thank you, Greg. Thank you so much for your time tonight. It is always very much appreciated.
Likewise. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Jackie. Have a good
night,
evening.
everyone.